Imagine getting bullied so hard, the universe itself said, fine, have sand powers. This is Xeon, a guy living in a world where weak people get treated worse than expired Wi-Fi passwords. One day, he gets thrown into a death trap.
Oh, shit.
Swallowed by a giant sandworm. Betrayed by literally everybody. And somehow survives. But instead of dying like a normal side character, Bro wakes up controlling sand like he's the final boss of the desert.
I don't like sand.
Now he's fighting monsters, surviving deadly dungeons, and training with an old man who solves every problem by punching it really hard. And trust me, this is only the beginning of Xeon's insane revenge journey. Everything kicks off in a savage world where power runs the whole game. If somebody is weak, they lose everything first. Their rights and their freedom, and sometimes even their life, gets taken away like it means nothing, and Xeon grows up stuck in that hell and gets treated like dirt in a place where mercy does not exist for broke and powerless people. A transport bus cuts through the endless desert when chaos suddenly crashes in out of nowhere. A gigantic sandworm explodes out of the ground and starts swallowing entire vehicles whole. And in that moment, Xeon already knows he is finished because a man without strength does not survive in this world. 100 years earlier, some mysterious beam of light slammed into the planet. That strange energy spread across the world and devoured everything alive, so cities died and nature disappeared, and the planet slowly turned into one giant dead desert. Humanity barely kept itself alive, so the survivors built a massive fortress just to avoid getting wiped out completely. While sitting quietly on the bus, Xeon keeps wondering why that disaster only left behind monstrous sandworms instead of wiping out everything entirely. Before he can think any deeper, a heavy fist slams into the seat beside him.
Oh, shit. Here we go again.
Some large man pretends it was an accident before throwing out a fake apology with a smug grin on his face, and then he starts acting friendly while demanding Xeon's name. Xeon already sees the disrespect coming, so he coldly introduces himself without showing emotion. The entire group instantly bursts out laughing after hearing Xeon only uses one name. They start mocking him and imply his mother probably never even knew who his father was. Xeon shoots them a furious stare, but the bully only enjoys watching him get angry. The man drops into the seat beside him and explains that nobody on this bus is innocent and that none of them are real minors. Every single person there is running away from some kind of trouble. Amused by himself, the man starts guessing Xeon's crime and throws around assault and fraud and theft like jokes between friends. And then out of nowhere, Xeon drives a hard punch straight into his face. The impact sends the man crashing into the window, and our boy proudly admits all his guesses were wrong. The real reason he is there is murder. Back in Neo Seoul, rich and powerful people can kill somebody and still sleep peacefully at night. The man talks about his victim like street trash who deserved to die for trying to rob him, but the problem starts when the dead man turns out to be the younger brother of Lee Ji-ryong. The second Xeon hears that name, the mood changes instantly. In this world, awakened people stand above normal humans like gods walking among insects, and crossing one of them is basically signing a death sentence. That fear is exactly why the murderer jumps onto the mining transport to escape Lee Ji-ryong's revenge, and after hearing the whole story without reacting, Xeon calmly tells the man that he is done talking. Then things turn ugly fast, because the bully suddenly notices a deep cut sliced across his own hand. Confusion flashes across his face for 1 second, and Xeon immediately takes advantage of it, so he drives a brutal kick straight into the man's face and sends him stumbling backward. Embarrassed and furious, the man grabs Xeon by the throat, and rage boils out of him as he warns Xeon about crossing the line. After running for his life from one awakened monster, he cannot believe another problem is standing in front of him already, and as that anger rises, energy suddenly starts glowing around his body. Everybody on the bus realizes the truth at the same time, because this man is awakened too. Panic instantly tears through the passengers, and the screaming and chaos make the bus shake violently across the unstable desert road. Irritated by the rough ride, the awakened man starts yelling at the driver to control the vehicle, but when everybody looks toward the front, nobody is behind the wheel. The awakened man tries to scream again, but the words die inside his throat the second he looks outside, because the bus is not driving anymore, and instead it is falling straight down as pure terror takes over. Xeon immediately understands the setup because none of the passengers were ever supposed to reach the mines. They were cargo and human bait getting dumped directly into the mouth of a giant sandworm, and as a result, despair explodes inside the bus while everybody falls screaming toward death. While dropping through the air, Zeon reflects on his entire life. Every moment follows the same rule because inside Neo's soul and standing before awakened monsters or falling into death right now, weak people always get crushed by the strong, and that reality finally breaks him. Zeon slowly stops resisting, and the fear inside him goes numb because he truly believes this is the only ending someone weak like him could ever have. Darkness closes around his mind, and even his dream of becoming stronger starts feeling pathetic, and then suddenly a hand bursts out from beneath the desert sand. A spiral of sand rises into the silent wasteland as Zeon's glowing eyes snap open, and he violently drags himself out from underground while choking for air like a man crawling back from death itself. His chest burns painfully while his body struggles to understand how he even survived, and at the same time some strange energy starts flowing through every bone in his body. After finally catching his breath, Zeon notices the massive corpse of the sandworm lying destroyed nearby, and shock hits him hard because none of this makes any sense. The ruined desert stays completely silent except for the sound of his own heartbeat echoing through the remains of a buried city, and a gigantic tower sticks halfway out of the sand while broken structures float across the dark, empty landscape like ghosts from a dead civilization. Zeon grits his teeth and stares across the devastated world, and then the power inside him fully awakens. Running purely on instinct, he raises one hand and creates a massive sand blaster, and the force explodes through the desert like a violent storm and tears everything apart in its path. Standing alone in that dead world, Zeon finally makes his choice because even in a cursed place where everything eventually turns to dust, he refuses to vanish like everybody else. Step by step, he keeps moving forward with only one thing left inside his heart, and that is that no matter what it costs, he is going to survive.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
After crawling back from a death that should have buried him for good, Zeon starts feeling something wild moving through his body, almost like every vein, every bone, and every breath got filled with a force that was never there before, and the more that energy spreads through him, the clearer everything becomes until the truth finally hits him straight in the face. He awakened. In a world where power means everything and weak people get stepped on daily like trash in the street, Zeon finally gains something of his own. The problem is, the desert does not even give him time to process it properly before chaos kicks the door down again. The ground suddenly explodes apart as another gigantic sandworm erupts from beneath the desert with a roar loud enough to shake the air itself, and the monster instantly starts tearing through the land like an angry demon that just woke up starving. Sand flies everywhere while the creature slams its massive body around without restraint, destroying everything near it so violently that Zeon barely has time to react before another figure suddenly crashes down from the sky like a damn missile. The newcomer moves toward the worm with the confidence of somebody handling old business instead of fighting a monster capable of wiping out entire transports. And without wasting a second, the man calmly pulls back his fist while a dangerous look flashes through his eyes. Then the punch lands. The impact detonates across the desert with such ridiculous force that the shockwave alone sends Zeon flying through the air like dead weight. And when he crashes into the sand, pain immediately tears through his body while dust fills his mouth and lungs. Even while coughing and struggling to breathe properly, he keeps staring ahead because what he just witnessed feels completely unreal. Some random stranger drops out of nowhere and obliterates a giant sandworm with one hit like it was nothing serious. Meanwhile, not far away, some energetic girl casually complains that the monster looks boring and probably tastes terrible after eating weird junk all day, acting like the whole situation is just another normal afternoon. At the center of it all, the warrior calmly stands on top of the dead sandworm while resting a massive sword across his shoulder like he did not just erase a monster capable of slaughtering dozens of people. And as the creature's enormous corpse collapses deeper into the desert with another heavy crash, a giant cloud of dust spreads across the air again. Watching that scene while clutching his injured arm, Zeon finally understands the terrifying difference between himself and a real awakener, because the same creature that almost killed him gets wiped out effortlessly by somebody standing on an entirely different level. The loud girl suddenly rushes toward the warrior with pure excitement written all over her face, and while proudly hugging his arm, she starts hyping up Captain Jang Young-beom's insane strength while celebrating their new speed record like she just watched her favorite fighter win a championship match. Zeon can barely keep up with any of it because one second he is trying to process the captain's monstrous power, and the next second the girl grabs his arm out of nowhere with enough force to nearly pull it out of place. Overflowing with energy, she starts rambling about how sandworms are not even difficult opponents, while dragging him around the desert like she found some rare collectible, and no matter how annoyed Zeon gets, her strength makes resisting almost impossible. So he ends up getting hauled through the sand like luggage while cursing under his breath. Still completely fired up, the girl starts demanding everybody guess Zeon's rank and ability while dramatically lifting his arm like she is presenting a trophy to a crowd, but then her excitement suddenly freezes. Something feels off. Already irritated from being dragged around non-stop, Zeon yanks his arm back aggressively while muttering curses to himself, and that is when the girl notices the real issue. There is no rank badge on his wrist at all. The confusion immediately spreads across her face because awakened people are supposed to carry official marks, yet Zeon has nothing visible. Meanwhile, exhausted from everything happening around him, Zeon just stays sprawled across the sand, while the girl keeps trying to understand how somebody awakened could exist outside the system entirely. Before the conversation goes any further, a voice suddenly shouts from inside the armored vehicle, warning everybody to hurry because sunset is coming fast and staying out in the desert too long is basically suicide. Still holding on to Zeon, the girl turns toward the captain and points out that abandoning him out there would be the same as killing him outright. And while Captain Jang Yong-beom keeps his calm expression, his eyes carefully study Zeon in complete silence. That stare alone makes Zeon tense up because it feels like the man is trying to look straight through him. After thinking for a brief moment, the captain finally decides to throw him into the vehicle since his destination is probably the mines anyway, and not long after that, the jeep starts speeding across the endless desert while giant clouds of orange sand rise behind it. Inside the vehicle, the driver immediately starts arguing with Captain Jang Yong-beom for constantly charging into dangerous situations alone without listening to anybody else, and while the heated complaints continue in the background, Zeon quietly leans back in one corner and realizes the ride feels way more comfortable than anything he has experienced in a long time. Still, his thoughts keep drifting back toward the missing badge on his wrist because the memory of that bright awakening light refuses to leave his mind. As he carefully studies his restrained hands again, the truth slowly becomes impossible to deny. His ability controls sand itself. At the same time, another detail keeps bothering him because nobody else can even see his mark properly, and after staring more closely, Zeon finally notices why. The lines on his wrist carry the exact same color as the desert around him, blending in perfectly like they were designed to stay hidden. That realization instantly reminds him of something Giselle explained earlier about awakened marks, reflecting a person's affinity. Magic users carry blue marks while close combat fighters carry deep red ones, which means his own ability falls into something completely different. Rare affinities exist, but even Zeon has never heard of anyone controlling sand itself, and the uniqueness of that power immediately makes him realize how dangerous and valuable it could become. Even if the system throws him into the weakest F-rank category, deep down he already knows this ability holds way more potential than anybody would expect. A faint smile slowly creeps across his face because he understands one important thing better than ever now: attention gets people killed. So instead of showing off, Zeon decides to keep his abilities hidden for the time being and quietly endure whatever hell comes his way until he fully masters what he has gained. Deep inside, one thought becomes crystal clear to him. This endless desert is eventually going to become his territory. After some time passes, the jeep finally arrives at the mining area where massive facilities are built directly into gigantic canyon walls, stretching across the desert like scars carved into the earth itself. While walking through the place, Zeon carefully studies the guards and realizes the mine almost feels normal compared to the nightmare waiting outside. One aggressive guard immediately starts barking orders at him to move faster and shut his mouth, but Zeon snaps back without hesitation and demands to be untied first, because he is already sick of getting treated like chained-up cargo. Meanwhile, far behind him, Captain Jang Yong-beom receives confirmation that Zeon is somehow the only survivor from the destroyed transport bus, and while Giselle casually brushes it off as coincidence, the captain clearly does not buy that explanation for a second. A heavy expression settles across his face, because the whole situation feels wrong to him on every level, especially the massive hole carved into the desert sand that keeps replaying inside his mind no matter how much he tries to ignore it. At the same time, Zeon continues walking deeper into the dark mining tunnel, while quietly regretting not learning the captain's name earlier because for some reason he cannot explain, one feeling keeps sticking to him stronger than anything else. Their paths are definitely crossing again. After stepping out of the tunnel, Zeon walks straight into a whole different kind of hell. Beneath all that endless desert, an entire underground city is packed inside the mines like a bunch of forgotten people shoved under the floorboards so the rich bastards above can keep pretending the world still works. Tight alleys overflow with noise and sweat while workers drag supplies through the dirt. Exhausted families cook scraps beside tiny broken homes, and worn-out people crowd every corner looking like they are one missed meal away from collapsing. The whole place feels alive and dead at the same damn time, and honestly, the sight catches Zeon off guard because he never expected this many people to actually survive underground like rats trapped beneath the city. While he stands there trying to process everything, the guard immediately tells him to shut his mouth and wait quietly, like some obedient dog. But after everything Zeon already survives, that attitude starts pissing him off fast. He asks if they seriously plan on leaving him there, and the officer instantly responds by raising a gun toward him without hesitation while talking down to him like human trash. According to the guard, useless people like Zeon never accomplish a damn thing anyway. Then the bastard simply walks off without another word, leaving Zeon standing there hungry, irritated, and ready to snap at somebody. Since nobody seems interested in watching him anymore, Zeon decides finding food matters more than sitting around angry, so he starts wandering through the cramped alleys until the smell of grilled meat finally catches his attention. An old man stands behind a tiny food stall turning skewers over a weak little flame while smoke fills the dirty underground air, and just as Zeon walks up politely, his eyes drift toward the massive poster hanging behind the stand. Some fake inspirational garbage about Neo Soul, shining bright through the hard work and sacrifice of its people, stares down at everybody like propaganda shoved in their faces daily to stop them from realizing they are getting played. The old vendor notices Zeon staring at the poster and hands him a skewer with sarcasm dripping from every word coming out of his mouth. And while showing the rough calluses covering his hands, the old man explains that Neo Soul does not survive because of mana stones like people claim. That statement instantly throws Zeon off because the entire city practically worships those damn stones. So while chewing the skewer, he starts wondering what actually keeps the place alive if it is not mana. That is when the old man points directly at him. People like them are the real fuel. The vendor smiles while explaining how underground workers are treated worse than disposable garbage because they spend their entire lives digging, starving, suffering, and dying down there just so the rich people above can keep drinking clean water and sleeping comfortably at night. Then, after looking Zeon up and down carefully, the old man notices the kid talks a little too boldly for somebody fresh inside the mines, and because of that attitude, he casually comments that Zeon already looks prepared to die early, like every other loudmouth rookie who walks in thinking they are different. Soon, the conversation shifts toward the transport incident because rumors about the sandworm attack already spread across the underground city, and obviously everybody knows Zeon somehow crawled out alive. Still, instead of showing sympathy, the old vendor openly calls him a pathetic rookie and warns him not to misunderstand how this place works because nobody comes to the mines and gets rich overnight. To make his point clear, the old man gestures toward a dark corner nearby filled with dusty boxes, broken tools, and abandoned junk piled together like forgotten memories. At first, Zeon thinks the old guy is just rambling nonsense again, but the seller quickly shuts that thought down. Those abandoned belongings used to belong to miners who came underground trying to survive. In the beginning, every newcomer avoids entering the dangerous mana stone tunnels because fear keeps them alive, but hunger eventually corners everybody the same way, so little by little, they sell off everything they own just to survive one more day. The mines strip people down piece by piece until nothing remains. Money disappears first, then dignity, then eventually even the person themselves gets erased like they never existed. The seller coldly explains that even dead people usually leave their names behind somewhere, but trash like Zeon probably will not leave anything except worthless scraps buried underground. His stare alone makes the whole alley feel heavier, but Zeon refuses to fold under the pressure and just focuses on finishing his food instead. Then, after taking the last bite, he asks for the price and almost chokes on the spot when the old man calmly demands 10 Sol coins for a single damn skewer. Shock immediately spreads across Zeon's face because the thing barely looks worth a fraction of that price, so he angrily compares it to meat dipped in gold while trying to understand how anybody could charge something so ridiculous. At the same time, he awkwardly admits he does not even carry that kind of money on him, and deep down, he already knows this whole setup smells like a scam targeting desperate newcomers. The second those words leave his mouth, the old vendor completely drops the friendly old man act. Without hesitation, the bastard reaches beneath the stand and pulls out a massive butcher cleaver right there in the middle of the alley. Even while staring directly at the blade, Zeon still stubbornly refuses to pay because getting extorted like this only makes his blood boil harder, but that confidence disappears almost instantly when the old man suddenly moves way faster than somebody his age should even be capable of moving. A heavy sound echoes through the alley as Zeon gets lifted clean off the ground by his throat. While choking inside that crushing grip, reality finally slams into him hard, because old men surviving alone in a place this brutal are never harmless. The seller calmly tightens his grip while mocking Zeon's pathetic struggling, and beneath the filthy clothes and weathered face, the old man's scarred muscles expose the truth. This bastard has been dangerous the whole damn time. Barely able to breathe, Zeon desperately tries calming the situation down while insisting that charging 10 coins for one skewer is straight-up robbery, and instead of fighting back recklessly, he starts pushing for some kind of peaceful solution before things get uglier. The old man listens calmly because the panic spreading across Zeon's face already gives him complete control over the situation. Then the seller finally reveals what he actually wants: the mana stone hidden inside Zeon's pocket. That single sentence freezes Zeon cold because somehow word about the valuable stone already spread through the underground city faster than wildfire. The seller stretches out his hand confidently while demanding the stone and promising fair payment in return, but at the same time, he grips the cleaver tighter while muttering about all the filthy things he has to do just to survive and protect his business down there. Sweat slowly rolls down Zeon's face while his brain desperately searches for a way out, so he weakly tries bargaining for more time while asking the old man to either forget the payment for now or allow him to pay later. Then right in the middle of that tension, one of the seller's thugs suddenly storms over and starts bitching loudly about the delay. Already irritated, the thug orders the old man to stop wasting time and kill Zeon already. The next second, the old seller casually unleashes a massive blast of sand magic straight into the thug without even blinking. The attack detonates through the alley with terrifying force and launches the guy backward like a broken doll while debris explodes everywhere, walls crack apart, and chunks of stone fly across the underground street. Dust immediately fills the air, and standing there in the middle of the destruction, Zeon can only stare in complete disbelief because for the second damn time since entering the mines, he witnesses somebody using strength far beyond what normal people should possess. Before he can even process what just happened, the thug suddenly grabs Zeon by the head again and violently forces his attention back toward him. The old seller grows irritated seeing Zeon distracted during such a serious moment, while Zeon finally realizes this entire situation is spiraling into a complete nightmare way faster than he expected. Our guy finally reaches into his pocket and pulls out the glowing blue mana stone the old bastard has been eyeing this whole time, but even while handing it over, the hesitation on Zeon's face says everything, because by now he already understands how valuable those crystals are down in the underground. In a place where people stab each other over scraps and stale food, holding on to something like that basically means holding on to survival itself. The old vendor carefully lifts the stone into the dim light and starts inspecting it like some greedy pawn shop shark checking stolen jewelry, studying the size, the shine, and the quality with narrowed eyes before finally placing a value on it. 100 Sol coins. The number immediately pisses Zeon off. Resources are scarce as hell underground, and Zeon already knows the crystal should be worth way more than that weak offer. Anger instantly starts burning through him while he complains about the insult, comparing the way the old man talks about the stone to worthless worm crap dug out of the dirt. Frustrated by the garbage deal, Zeon sharply turns around and starts walking off before his temper pushes things too far because deep down, he honestly feels like he could probably beat the old man if the situation turned ugly, but he also understands this is not the smartest place to start throwing fists around carelessly. Still, before fully leaving, Zeon throws one last hard glare over his shoulder and demands at least some decent damn change for the stone instead of getting completely robbed. The old vendor lets out a cynical little grin and agrees while warning him to guard his money carefully because this underground city is crawling with thieves, scammers, and desperate bastards exactly like him. Then, acting almost generous for once, the old man tells Zeon he can grab any item he wants from the abandoned junk pile nearby as part of the exchange. Zeon looks over the mountain of broken trash with obvious reluctance before finally accepting the offer because wasting value in a place like this feels stupid, so he starts digging through the junk while quietly hoping some useful item got overlooked among the scraps. The deeper he searches, the more disappointed he becomes because most of the pile is nothing but shattered tools, rusted metal, and worthless garbage abandoned by people who probably died underground years ago. Meanwhile, the old vendor watches the whole thing with amusement written all over his face because he already knows every item sitting there is basically useless, and watching Zeon desperately try squeezing extra value out of the deal entertains him more than expected. Then eventually, buried beneath the pile, Zeon notices something strange. An old hourglass. The thing looks worn down and ancient, but for some reason the second Zeon picks it up. Something about it feels weirdly heavy in his hands despite its size. The vendor casually explains that some merchant caravan abandoned it a long time ago, and since nothing else in the pile catches his attention anyway, Zeon decides to keep the strange artifact. The old man instantly starts clowning him for having terrible taste in collectibles, but honestly, Zeon barely even reacts anymore because he is too busy thinking about why the hourglass feels oddly familiar despite never seeing it before in his life. As he walks away through the filthy underground alleys, he casually asks the vendor's name, and the old man introduces himself as Klexi. Zeon gives him a sarcastic farewell while hoping their paths never cross again, because dealing with that psycho once already feels like more than enough. Meanwhile, back inside the dark alley, Klexi quietly laughs to himself while reflecting on how unpredictable tomorrow can become in a place like this. Later that night, the strange hourglass sits silently on the floor inside Zeon's tiny little room at the miner's lodging while dark sand slowly slips through the glass, leaving roughly 10 minutes before it completely empties out. Exhausted from all the chaos, Zeon sits on the stiff bed trying to steady his breathing, while everything from the desert, the underground city, and the encounter with Klexi keeps replaying inside his head non-stop like a bad dream refusing to end. After calming himself a little, his full attention shifts toward the hourglass. His glowing eyes lock onto the falling sand while he mentally commands it to move, because if his awakened power truly controls sand itself, then logically the object should react somehow. Zeon focuses harder and pours all his concentration into it while waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nothing. The silence instantly frustrates him because the hourglass shows absolutely no connection to his power at all. Resting his head against one hand, Zeon starts thinking carefully about why the object feels so important despite making no sense whatsoever. Even without understanding the reason, this unsettling sense of familiarity keeps crawling through the back of his mind because back inside the shop, the hourglass almost felt like it was waiting specifically for him. Then suddenly, an image flashes through his thoughts. A gagged girl. The vision appears only briefly, but the strange familiarity wrapped around her presence hits him hard like some forgotten memory clawing its way out from deep inside darkness itself. Before Zeon can process what the hell he just saw, the bedroom door violently bursts open. A massive brute fills the doorway with pure anger written across his face. The guy immediately starts talking down to Zeon while demanding to know why he is still sitting around hiding in the lodging instead of reporting to the mines already. Every word dripping from the man's mouth makes it obvious he hates wasting time and feels annoyed he personally had to come drag Zeon there himself. Still, despite all that hostility, Zeon barely reacts and calmly repeats the guy's name, Park Manhwa, before pointing out that nobody actually bothered explaining where he was supposed to go in the first place. That response instantly lights Park's fuse. Without hesitation, the brute swings a vicious punch straight at Zeon's face, but Zeon barely manages to avoid getting smashed by throwing himself backward at the last possible second. The miss actually surprises Park for a brief moment because he clearly did not expect a rookie to dodge him, but that shock only makes his anger explode even harder. The bastard immediately lunges forward again, grabs Zeon by the collar, and starts unloading punch after punch while rage pours out of every movement like he is trying to beat obedience directly into him. Park clearly lives by one rule. Weak people should shut up and accept abuse quietly. The beating only stops once an older miner suddenly steps in and orders Zeon to follow him immediately before things spiral even further. Bruised, aching, and pissed off, Zeon silently walks behind the older worker while clutching his arm, but deep inside, hatred toward Park Manhwa is already burning hard enough to leave scars. Zeon memorizes that bastard's face and name because he already promises himself one thing. One day, he is settling that debt personally. Eventually, they arrive at the entrance to Zone 3 mine, where local workers immediately greet Park respectfully, while the brute wastes no time ordering them to hand mining gear over to the newcomer. The supervisor awkwardly explains that the cost of the equipment will later be deducted from Zeon's earnings, but honestly, Zeon barely even listens because the only thing he cares about is how much money this hellhole actually pays. As he places the helmet onto his head, the supervisor starts trying to explain the payment system properly, but before he can even finish, a heavy pickaxe suddenly gets shoved straight into Zeon's hands. Already irritated beyond patience, Park Manhwa starts barking again while reminding everybody that the damn helmet costs money too. Then he curses at Zeon openly and orders him to get to work immediately without wasting another second. That is when Park deliberately sends him toward Tunnel 972, one of the most dangerous tunnels in the entire mining zone. The supervisor visibly hesitates because everybody there understands the order is insane for a newcomer, but fear shuts him up instantly once Park threatens Zeon directly and makes it crystal clear that coming back empty-handed will end very badly for him. Even with all that pressure hanging over his head, Zeon still refuses to stay quiet and mutters a mocking insult under his breath toward Park Manhwa because at this point, the anger boiling inside him is already stronger than his fear. The guide walking with Zeon looks at him with pity because the timing of his arrival works completely against him. He implies that Zeon finds himself in this situation on the same day Park Manhwa loses everything in gambling, and that is why the boss's anger reaches its peak. While talking further, Zeon hears that the underground mine is not different from Neo Soul, since gambling and alcohol and drugs and prostitution all exist there in the same way. They enter an old elevator that groans as it descends, and Zeon casually notes that people like Park are probably the reason such places remain active. While adjusting to everything, he complains about having to actually work in the mine, and the guide then shifts the tone by telling him not to worry about injuries in a way that feels strange and unsettling, as if it carries a hidden meaning. That feeling becomes clearer when the elevator stops and the entrance to Tunnel 972 appears. The passage ahead is completely dark and feels dangerous in a way that cannot be ignored. Zeon still steps forward confidently and says he will return quickly, but the guide immediately undermines that confidence by telling him that nobody returns from this place. The guide further explains that people have already disappeared inside this tunnel, leaving no trace behind, and his voice carries guilt as he indirectly treats this moment like a farewell. It becomes clear that Zeon is being sent somewhere no one else is willing to go, and after realizing the truth, Zeon understands that this is not a normal assignment but a setup designed to get rid of him. Panic hits him immediately, and he tries to stop the elevator from leaving, but it already starts rising and seals him inside the darkness alone. Left behind, he stands still for a moment while processing that he has been abandoned in a place meant for death. Anger quickly replaces shock, and he starts hitting the rocks with the pickaxe, while blaming everyone for throwing him there just because of a bad mood from Park Manhwa. In his frustration, he keeps striking the wall until the tool slips from his hands and flies into a crack deeper inside the cave. When he moves to retrieve it, the atmosphere inside the tunnel starts to change. A thick mist spreads and an unusual pressure builds in the air, which makes the place feel unnatural. As he moves further, he slowly realizes the tunnel is filled with dense, magical energy and something only awakened people can sense. With every step, the pressure increases, and he understands that a normal person would not survive this depth. Reaching the end of the passage, he carefully looks ahead and spots his pickaxe lying on the ground. Relief shows for a moment when he finds it, even though the handle is already damaged, and that relief disappears immediately when he notices the ground glowing red beneath him. He realizes too late that he is standing inside a massive active portal, and before he can move away, the floor disappears and his body drops straight into it. Gravity drags him into complete darkness, while the broken pickaxe falls with him into the void. While falling, memories of his past life surface, showing how he always struggled just to survive in a world where the strong crush the weak. He remembers being chased and beaten and forced to run through the streets while only wishing for a normal life where he did not have to fight every day just to exist. The fall suddenly ends when his face hits solid ground on the other side, and he gets up slowly while holding his head and feeling disoriented. The heat around him is intense and unnatural, and when he touches the ground, he realizes it is covered in ash, and that single detail makes everything clear in his mind because he understands that he has been dropped into a dangerous, dungeon-like area. A violent eruption suddenly breaks out nearby and throws molten magma into the air just a few feet from where he lands. The heat spreads instantly and his skin starts burning as soon as he comes in contact with the surrounding air, and even his hand begins to burn because the environment is too extreme to handle, which pushes him straight into panic. This pressure forces him to run without control as he moves away from the blast zone while frustration builds up and he reacts to the unbearable temperature. He then slows down for a moment to breathe, but the thick heated air makes it difficult to recover. This situation makes him realize that entering a place like this without proper preparation in Neo Soul would have been a mistake. While looking at his soot-covered hands, he understands that breathing volcanic ash for too long will damage his lungs badly, so he quickly shifts into survival mode. Because staying still increases the risk of death, he immediately crouches and tightens his boots to make sure he can run properly. After that, he wraps cloth around his face to reduce the amount of toxic air entering his body, since he assumes there must be an exit somewhere in this dangerous zone. As he focuses on the glowing lava mountain ahead, Zeon becomes certain that the return portal must be located at the highest point, and this thought pushes him forward because standing still feels more dangerous than moving. Since there are no monsters around him at that moment, he decides to use that small advantage and start running toward the peak. He steps onto the burning ground and commits fully to taking the fastest possible route. The extreme situation increases his adrenaline, and he sprints with full energy and even shouts his own name to keep his motivation high. However, this confidence breaks immediately when he steps on a loose rock near the edge of a cliff and loses his balance, and as a result, his body moves forward without control, and he falls face first onto the ground. He then slides down the slope at high speed while trying to stop himself, but the steep surface keeps pulling him downward, and this creates panic because there is lava below. The movement only stops when he finally crashes into a pile of jagged rocks with strong impact. After the fall, he lies there shaking and covered in sweat, but he still lifts his head and tries to act strong by claiming that lava will not stop him. However, the impact has already drained most of his strength, so his body remains weak and heavy, and this frustration builds into anger as he clenches his fists tightly while his knuckles turn white. Because of this anger, Zeon looks upward and shouts in rage, while blaming Park from the mine and promising revenge once he escapes. After releasing that emotion, he forces himself to move again, but quickly realizes that anger only wastes energy in this environment, so he decides to focus only on survival and keeps walking forward while trying to control his thoughts. He holds his shirt tightly and reminds himself that survival is the only goal left and pushes himself to continue no matter what. Since the terrain is still dangerous, he starts sprinting up the burning slope and calculates that only a few jumps are needed to reach his target. He jumps across a flowing lava river while staying fully focused on movement instead of hesitation, and because hesitation increases risk, he keeps pushing himself not to stop or think too much and only continue forward. He refuses to accept death in such a place, so he pushes on with full determination. While attempting another jump, he suddenly realizes that he is falling directly toward the open jaws of a massive magma creature, and because of this shock, the creature snaps its jaws shut in the exact area where he was mid-air, swallows the space completely. After that, the creature sinks back into the lava as if nothing happened, and the area becomes silent except for bubbling magma. This silence makes the environment feel even more dangerous, and it appears as if he has been completely swallowed without any trace left behind. However, the silence is broken by the sound of rocks cracking on the side of the mountain. Zeon then reappears panting and covered in soot, and he complains about the extreme heat while noticing that even ashes are starting to melt. When he looks at his hand, he realizes that he has gained control over volcanic ash, and this ability ends up saving his life in that moment. Because he pushed his power too far, his body became completely exhausted, and he collapsed in pain. He crawls forward slowly and realizes that the environment itself is more dangerous than the monsters inside it, and the heat becomes so intense that it affects his breathing and causes his consciousness to weaken. As he lies face down in the burning ground, he starts thinking that this might be the end of his journey. However, he refuses to accept that outcome and gathers the last bit of strength left in his hand, and this pushes him to stand again as he laughs weakly while thinking it is unfair to die without experiencing life properly. Because of this thought, he forces himself to run again across the rough terrain and uses his sand ability to increase his jumps while continuing forward. At the same time, a massive magma monster suddenly bursts out from behind him and breaks through the ground. This sudden attack causes him to panic, and he runs while screaming in fear. And while escaping, he suddenly hears a mysterious voice praising his sand manipulation skills. This shocks him, and he briefly wonders if someone like Yama is speaking to him. When he looks upward, he sees a strange figure descending from the sky, and through the smoke he realizes that the person is manipulating sand and appears calm in contrast to the chaos. To his shock, the figure drops straight toward the magma monster, and Zeon becomes completely stunned when he recognizes that it is just an old man with a grin. The old man then tightens his grip on a massive sword as he prepares to strike, and because the situation demands immediate action, he twists his body mid-air with force and brings the blade down in a single heavy motion meant to end everything in front of him. Since the attack comes down with extreme speed and pressure, Zeon understands that avoiding it normally is impossible, and because of that, he curls his body to protect his head and braces for impact instead of trying to escape. The moment the sword lands, the ground reacts violently as a shockwave spreads across the entire area. This impact is so strong that rocks and molten material are thrown into the air, and the force pushes Zeon backward without control. As a result, he loses balance completely and is thrown across the ground while destruction spreads around him. After the impact ends, he lies on the ground disoriented because his ears are ringing and his body cannot process what just happened. This confusion makes him search for the attacker, but his attention quickly shifts when he remembers the fire beast. However, that concern disappears when he sees the creature already cut in half, while the old man stands calmly beside it. Because of this sight, Zeon immediately understands that the man is far beyond normal awakeners, and the presence of Deordan surrounded by burning energy makes it clear that his strength is on a completely different level. Since the old man starts walking toward him with steady steps, Zeon reacts on instinct and moves backward while preparing himself. This fear makes him want to know what the man wants, but instead of a long explanation, Deordan only demands his name. Because the answer is not given immediately, the old man smiles in a threatening way and warns him to respond before counting to 3. After that, he begins the countdown slowly and makes each second feel heavier than the last. As he takes another step forward, he states that only a few seconds remain, and when time runs out, he declares that it is over. This pressure causes complete fear in Zeon, and he becomes unable to move or speak properly. Since the situation is fully controlled by the old man, Zeon's body freezes as panic takes over. Because of his silence, Deordan rests the sword on his shoulder and comments that he can force the answer easily if needed, and after that he decides that if the boy refuses to talk, he will simply be eliminated. This decision forces Zeon to react immediately, and he raises his hands while begging for mercy. Because of this reaction, the old man confirms that the boy is not mute and repeats his demand again. Under extreme pressure, Zeon finally shouts his name loudly, and after hearing it, the old man turns away and dismisses the name as weak, which causes Zeon to feel offended and want to know who is being insulted. Because of this reaction, the old man drives his sword into the ground with force and sends dust into the air. Then he looks back over his shoulder and introduces himself as Deordan. Since Zeon is already frustrated and exhausted, he complains about the situation and demands to know why he is being insulted and threatened without reason, and even after being saved, he still wants an explanation for what he did wrong, but he is interrupted again before receiving a proper answer. Because of the interruption, Deordan ignores his frustration and instead warns him that he has been caught inside a dangerous magical trap. He explains that the dungeon sometimes creates a secondary entrance to release excess energy, and because of that, anything nearby gets pulled inside as a defensive reaction. After hearing this, Zeon realizes his bad situation is caused by pure misfortune, which makes him mentally blame the mine boss again. However, because he is already annoyed, he tells the old man to stop insulting him repeatedly. Since the boy keeps complaining, Deordan loses patience and grabs his head firmly. He then instructs him to focus his magic into his eyes so he can see what is actually present in the environment. Because Zeon cannot break free, he is forced to follow the instruction and channels energy into his vision, and at the same time, the old man's voice continues to guide him by telling him to ignore normal sight and detect hidden danger. Instead, when he finally activates this perception, Zeon suddenly sees the outline of a terrifying creature standing close by, and because of this discovery, he reacts in shock, while Deordan confirms that the lesson has worked. Since the creature is revealed, Zeon understands that it is a stealth predator that kills prey before they can react, and this realization causes him to feel deep fear because the monster was already near him without triggering any warning. Because of this, he understands that he would have died instantly if the old man had not intervened. While looking at Deordan's back, he admits internally that this man has already saved his life twice. Since Deordan's power and calm behavior are beyond normal understanding, Zeon starts wondering just how strong he really is, and after that he finally asks who this man actually is. But instead of a detailed answer, Diordan repeats own name again while insulting him once more. Zeon reacts with frustration after hearing Diordan's earlier explanation and immediately demands to know his identity, while also wanting clarification about the strange place they are trapped in. This reaction happens because nothing about the situation feels normal, and his confusion keeps building with every passing second. Because of this complaint, Diordan continues walking through the destroyed landscape without any concern, and explains that the dungeon itself now functions as his personal hunting ground. He treats the entire place like it belongs to him, which only increases Zeon's disbelief. After that, the old man intentionally avoids giving a clear introduction and instead builds suspense around his identity. Since Zeon keeps pressing for answers, Diordan mocks the situation and informs him to rely on his own perception instead of waiting for explanations. At that moment, a dragging sound spreads through the ground, and a strange creature begins to rise from the rocky surface. This sudden movement shifts the situation again, because the environment itself reacts like it is alive. Because of this, the volcanic ground starts glowing, and a huge magic circle spreads across the battlefield, covering everything in sight. The noise becomes so loud and intense that Zeon covers his ears while trying to reduce the pressure and struggling to understand what Diordan is doing. As the effect expands, Zeon remains frozen because the scale of the phenomenon feels unreal, and he cannot process it fast enough to react. This confusion deepens when shadow-like wolf shapes start forming out of the burning ground around him. Since the battlefield is now completely transformed, Zeon becomes trapped inside a circle of moving threats, and fear takes over as he realizes he is surrounded from all sides. At the same time, Diordan finally calls out to him from a distance in an impatient tone. Because Zeon hesitates, Diordan swings his massive sword and informs him that survival now depends entirely on his own ability. This forces Zeon into immediate combat as the shadow beasts move in without delay. Due to the sudden pressure, Zeon instinctively steps back while mentally criticizing the old man's reckless behavior. When one of the beasts attacks, he throws a punch to defend himself, but the speed of the creatures makes it difficult to keep up. Since the enemies keep multiplying and pressing from every direction, Zeon tries using brute strength to push them back. However, the swarm does not break apart, and instead focuses its attacks mainly on his left side, which makes his defense uneven. Because of this imbalance, he quickly reacts by throwing a sand-based smokescreen to block their vision and create space. The dust briefly slows their movement, but the advantage disappears because more enemies continue to close in. As a result, Zeon gets fully surrounded and starts showing signs of exhaustion while pain builds from continuous hits. Even after activating his visual ability, he realizes that the creatures move too fast to track properly, which makes the situation worse. Since all escape routes are blocked and attacks keep coming from every direction, Zeon begins to panic and accepts that survival is becoming unlikely if nothing changes. While struggling in the fight, he notices Diordan in the distance and feels frustrated that he is still alive only because of that man's earlier intervention. Because the battlefield noise is too chaotic, Zeon cannot understand what Diordan is saying, while the old man continues complaining that his hearing is affected and he cannot properly catch Zeon's insults. This creates a strange contrast where both of them are communicating through chaos. Despite this, Zeon ignores the exchange and focuses entirely on finding a way to counter the fast-moving enemies that his eyes cannot properly follow. At the same time, Diordan's voice carries across the battlefield as he criticizes Zeon's lack of thinking ability. Since Zeon is still struggling, Diordan explains that he must shift his focus completely into his eyes and raise his mana perception. This instruction forces Zeon to channel his energy, and his pupils begin glowing as he follows the technique under pressure. Because of this activation, Zeon starts perceiving the battlefield differently and is told to rely on magical perception instead of normal sight. At that exact moment, a shadow beast attacks at full speed and aims directly at him. However, since the new perception is active, Zeon reacts instantly and dodges the strike, which lands heavily into the ground beside him. This successful dodge confirms that the technique is working, even though it is still unstable for him. As a result of adapting to this perception, Zeon begins to sense killing intent flowing through the air, which helps him track enemy movement more clearly. The hidden aura of the creatures becomes visible through the smoke, and he finally understands their timing. Because of this clarity, Zeon manages to counterattack at close range and destroys one of the beasts in a single clean motion. After landing the hit, he breathes heavily and looks toward Diordan while realizing that the old man had already predicted this outcome. This realization shocks him because it confirms that Diordan was guiding the entire situation from the beginning, and overwhelmed by this, Zeon demands to know what kind of monster the old man actually is. At that moment, Diordan laughs like he is enjoying the battle and continues cutting down multiple enemies at once without hesitation. His movements create massive destruction as energy bursts spread through the dungeon and light up the entire area. Because the fight intensifies, the dungeon shakes under the force of his attacks while he becomes more excited instead of tired. With a dangerous smile, Diordan becomes fully immersed in combat and demands that all remaining creatures attack him together. A massive rock creature bursts out from deep inside the magma and rushes straight toward Diordan, trying to crush him in a sudden attack. Because the attack is fast and heavy, it is ended immediately without any struggle, and the battlefield is cleared in an instant. Diordan's voice spreads through the cavern right after showing clear disappointment because the creature fails to give any challenge. Since the fight ends too easily, Diordan lowers his sword and complains while moving through the sea of flames. His frustration grows because nothing in the dungeon pushes him to his limit, and this makes him remember earlier times when stronger dungeons used to exist. From a distance, Zeon watches this and quietly accepts that the monsters look helpless against someone at this level. After the destruction settles, the entire crater becomes filled with silence and remains of destroyed creatures. This sight leaves Zeon stunned because the scale of killing is far beyond anything he expected, and because everything finally looks finished, he relaxes slightly and assumes that the danger has ended. This assumption immediately creates trouble because a sudden sense of danger hits him right after. Since he speaks too soon, a massive shockwave follows and shakes the whole dungeon while destabilizing the ground beneath them. Because of this pressure, Zeon loses balance and stumbles while the air itself feels heavier. The pressure keeps increasing until his body can no longer resist it, which forces him down onto his knees. Because of the strain, he becomes sick and struggles just to stay conscious while the environment feels like it is crushing him from all sides. When he tries to understand the source of this force, Diordan calmly informs him that the final boss has just revealed itself. Because of that explanation, magma starts rising violently, and a huge shape forms inside the lava. The creature slowly emerges with overwhelming presence while blue flames cover its body and fill the entire area with dangerous energy. Since the pressure increases even more, Zeon panics and realizes that this monster is the real ruler of the dungeon. While Zeon reacts with fear, Diordan shows excitement instead because a real opponent has finally appeared, and this contrast makes it clear that both of them are seeing the situation very differently. The creature then lets out a loud roar and reveals itself as a crimson drake. Because Zeon is confused by its appearance, he wants to know whether it is actually a dragon, but Diordan dismisses that idea and explains that it is still only a B-rank monster. As the drake gathers blue energy in its mouth, its magical power confirms the seriousness of the situation. Since the attack buildup shows advanced control, Diordan notes that the creature has a domain ability and further explains that high-level beasts develop unique combat traits, and this one focuses on magical dominance. Because the drake activates its power, the temperature suddenly drops and ice spikes begin forming across the battlefield. This unnatural shift changes the environment completely as the blue aura spreads and freezes the lava area. Without warning, the drake releases a massive blast of glacial energy aimed directly at Diordan. Because of the overwhelming scale of the attack, Zeon panics and complains that such abilities are unfair and impossible to deal with. However, before the attack lands, the entire ice technique is destroyed instantly by a red cross-shaped slash that cuts through the air. Since the attack is erased in a single moment, Zeon becomes completely shocked and cannot process what he just witnessed, and because of this, he realizes that all his effort and experience mean nothing in front of this level of power. At that moment, the drake dives down again with full force, trying to finish the fight in one final attack. Because it moves with killing intent, it opens its mouth and prepares a concentrated energy strike meant to destroy its target. Diordan responds without hesitation by taking his stance and spinning his greatsword for a counterattack. Since his body is fully engaged, he charges forward with overwhelming strength while shouting in battle excitement. Because the drake also prepares a final attack, it forms a destructive energy sphere inside its jaws, and this action confirms that both sides are now committing everything to the clash. Diordan responds with a fierce grin because he is enjoying the fight instead of fearing it. When both forces collide, Diordan brings his blade down with extreme force and crushes the boss into the ground. Because of the impact, he mocks the creature while laughing and then declares that he will personally end it. Since the fight escalates further, he releases another heavy strike filled with raw energy and announces that this is the monster's end. Meanwhile, Zeon is forced to run through the battlefield while trying to avoid destruction from both sides. Because of the ongoing chaos, he screams that he is the one who will end up dying instead, and while dodging shadow beasts and flying debris, he curses both fighters and wishes they would stop or move away. During this escape, a shockwave hits him directly and injures him. Since the Drake continues attacking, it releases energy spikes across the battlefield and increases destruction everywhere. Because of this, Zeon struggles to stay upright and complains that the fight itself is more dangerous than the enemies. At the same time, Daeordan continues laughing and enjoying the battle, and even mocks the Drake while treating the destruction like a game. Suddenly, another massive attack explodes across the ground and sends debris everywhere. Because Zeon is caught in the blast, he is thrown into the air without control, and since he has no way to stabilize himself, he realizes he is about to fall again. His body crashes down heavily onto the dungeon floor and continues rolling due to the force of impact. Because the terrain is still burning, he cannot stop his movement and keeps bouncing across the rocks. After the fall, he looks up while injured and notices the Crimson Drake preparing another concentrated energy attack directly above him. Daeordan keeps pressure on the beast and stays right behind it while laughing like the fight is nothing serious. Because the creature still tries to resist, he brings his sword down with brutal force and smashes its head into the ground, and as a result, mocks it as a complete failure compared to real dungeon bosses. Even after being pinned, the monster does not stop and continues gathering destructive blue energy inside its jaws. Because of this stubborn reaction, Daeordan shows a slight smile and acknowledges the trick while treating it like something interesting instead of dangerous. In response, a huge pillar of light suddenly erupts from deep below and tears straight through the cave ceiling. Because this creates a gap in the battlefield, the monster immediately uses it to release a rain of freezing spikes across the area. While doing this, it tries to locate its target again but cannot sense the old man anywhere nearby. Because of this confusion, it quickly reacts when it hears Daeordan's calm voice coming from above and shifts its attention upward. At that exact moment, Daeordan drops down like a red meteor and crashes into the monster with his massive sword, and because of the force of the impact, the beast is crushed instantly and lets out a scream of pain. After landing, Daeordan presses his weapon onto the defeated creature and explains that he spent a full year in the desert just to hunt it down. Because of that effort, he now ends it without hesitation and finishes the fight. Right after that, the hilt of his great sword begins to pulse with dark energy, and because of this reaction, the blade behaves like a void and starts pulling in the monster's life force while tearing it apart and absorbing its power. As this process completes, the weapon fully absorbs the energy and changes into a bright, intense red glow. Because of this transformation, Daeordan raises the sword and releases an aura of pure destruction around him. He then checks the weapon's condition and feels satisfied with how much power it has gained from the fight, and because of this result, he laughs slightly and praises his weapon for improving after the battle. However, his moment is interrupted when Zeon speaks from a distance in an exhausted voice and judges him for talking to a weapon. Because of this interruption, Daeordan reacts with surprise that Zeon is still alive after everything. Buried in rubble and heavily injured, Zeon confirms that he almost died during the earlier clash, and because of this realization, he tries to push himself up, but his body gives out and he falls back again. Since his strength is fully drained, he collapses face first into the dusty ground and struggles to move. Because of exhaustion, even simple movement becomes difficult, and frustration builds as he fails to hold himself up. After forcing his body again, he manages to lift himself slightly from the ground, and because of this small recovery, he feels relieved that he has survived once more and realizes he is harder to kill than expected. At the same time, Daeordan comments that Zeon's body has become unusually durable from all the damage he has taken. Because of this observation, he places his sword on his back and warns that the dungeon is collapsing and they need to leave. Confused by the situation, Zeon wants to know what is happening, and because of this, Daeordan only laughs and does not explain clearly. Instead, he suddenly grabs Zeon without warning, and because of this sudden action, throws him directly toward a glowing portal. As a result, Zeon screams while being launched through the air and curses the old man for his behavior. His body crashes through the portal and lands hard on the sandy ground outside. Because of the impact, he slides across the desert while coughing and spitting sand. After recovering slightly, Zeon wants to know where they have arrived, and because of this, Daeordan steps out of the portal and explains that it is the natural exit of the dungeon. Since Zeon is angry, he demands to know why they did not simply walk out, and because of this complaint, Daeordan interrupts him and tells him to stay quiet and listen. At that point, Daeordan explains that he needs Zeon's sand-controlling ability, but also points out that it is useless if Zeon remains weak. Because of this, he gives him a choice. He then points toward the distant city and explains that Zeon can return there and continue his normal life, and because of this option, it represents safety and comfort. After that, he presents another option where Zeon follows him and becomes stronger through training and hardship, and because of this alternative, it clearly shows a dangerous and uncertain path. When Zeon wants to know how long this will last, Diorden replies that it could take months or even decades depending on the situation, and because of this uncertainty, the future remains completely unpredictable. At that moment, Diorden pressures him to decide immediately, and because of this demand, the situation becomes tense as Zeon is forced to choose between safety and a dangerous journey. Zeon slowly pushes himself up and lets out a dry laugh after hearing the offer. Because the proposal sounds completely insane to him, he points directly at Diorden and reacts as if he has completely lost his mind. He explains that abandoning a safe, comfortable life to wander the deadly desert makes no sense. The idea seems unreasonable. He expects a correction, but Diorden calmly confirms this is exactly what he means. That answer immediately changes Zeon's mood. While holding his injured arm, his expression hardens, and the joking attitude disappears. Because he already understands how weak he currently is, he ends the argument and decides to follow Diorden instead. He admits he never forgets grudges, but knows revenge is impossible now. So, he warns that Diorden is among those he will surpass someday. Zeon admits Diorden is the strongest he has faced. Determined, he declares his goal, making Diorden burst out laughing at our boy's confidence. Even after hearing that, Zeon clenches his fist and insists that following Diorden will eventually make him stronger than everyone else. Unwilling to doubt himself, he meets Diorden's grin and warns that such confidence will later become a source of regret. Without wasting more time, Diorden orders him to start moving because the journey ahead is long. As Diorden continues to insult him during the walk, Zeon demands that he stop calling him an idiot. The desert heat grows harsher as time passes. Sunlight burns down across the endless wasteland. Since they continue walking non-stop for hours, Zeon quickly becomes exhausted and drenched in sweat. After 6 hours of walking, he begs for a break, his body on the verge of giving out. Diorden keeps walking, not turning around, completely ignoring the complaints behind him. This silent treatment frustrates Zeon even more, so he demands to know why Diorden has suddenly stopped responding. At the same time, the heat keeps getting worse, and his skin feels like it is burning under the temperature. Because the sand keeps sinking beneath every step, moving forward drains him of even more energy. Zeon stumbles. He feels weaker with every stride. Eventually, he realizes that dehydration and heat stroke are becoming real dangers. At his limit, he collapses, momentum lost. Diorden criticizes him, calling his struggle pathetic for using only 0.1% of his potential. To prove his point, Diorden plants his sword in the sand and reminds Zeon that sand is literally his element. With the ground made entirely of sand, Diorden cannot understand why walking seems so difficult. Zeon, frustrated, argues it's easy for someone experienced to lecture. He reminds Diorden his powers awakened only 2 days ago. Diorden immediately dismisses that excuse and explains that the timing changes nothing. Because Zeon keeps comparing himself to stronger awakeners, he argues that he is only a weak, low-rank fighter, while Diorden belongs at a completely different level. That explanation only angers Diorden further. He raises his voice and rejects the entire idea of depending on rankings. According to him, powerful people are not simply born special while everyone else stays weak forever. As they continue moving, Diorden keeps lecturing him and explains that, compared to ordinary people, Zeon is already blessed with extraordinary abilities. Because of that, quitting now would only mean wasting the opportunity he already received. Silenced, Zeon walks and thinks seriously about the power he gained and what it means. Diorden tells him to stop whining. He urges him to use his brain properly instead of relying on excuses. The pressure works. Zeon finally focuses on his own abilities rather than his frustration. Staring at his hands, Zeon realizes only he controls this power. Diorden's voice reminds him that breaking limits is his own responsibility. Even as fatigue claws at him, Zeon hauls himself upright from the scorching ground, anger smoldering behind his eyes. Diorden's threat to abandon him finally pushes him past the breaking point, and Zeon snaps, spitting that he understands perfectly, refusing to let himself falter again. Determined not to collapse again, he steps onto the shifting sand and tests a new idea, concentrating energy to create a small sandstorm. Measuring his control, he finds he can manipulate sand within a 5-meter radius. Since sand is the main obstacle, he decides stabilizing the terrain will greatly reduce his exhaustion. With that thought in mind, he He compresses the loose sand beneath his feet and creates a harder surface to walk on. The moment it works, he becomes excited because his feet finally stop sinking into the dunes. However, the success does not last long. The technique consumes too much mana. He quickly realizes he cannot maintain it for extended periods. Instead of giving up, he changes his approach and focuses his energy directly on his legs. This adjustment immediately makes movement easier and reduces the strain on his body. While watching this process, Deordan notices that Xian is combining ideas and adapting quickly through trial and error. That sight reminds him of his younger days and leaves him quietly nostalgic. Although Xian keeps tripping and falling, he always gets back up. This stubborn persistence makes Deordan increasingly interested in his progress. As training continues, Xian's control over energy improves quickly. After repeated failures, he discovers the right balance and realizes his method finally works. Excited by the breakthrough, he runs toward Deordan and proudly explains that he is now controlling only the exact grains beneath his feet, rather than wasting energy on the entire area. The success immediately fills him with confidence, and he starts bragging about how easy walking has become for him now. He even acts smug toward Deordan and challenges him to try the same method. That attitude earns him a direct punch to the head from Deordan. Because of the hit, Xian crashes back into the sand while Deordan criticizes his careless personality. Deordan warns him that wasting energy on unnecessary tricks will eventually get him killed. Right after hearing that lecture, Xian's exhausted body finally shuts down completely, and he loses consciousness in the sand. The sudden collapse catches Deordan off guard. He panics and immediately tries to make sure that our boy keeps breathing. Xian regains consciousness and weakly mutters as his mind struggles to place where he is. He finds himself beside a rough campfire when a harsh old man declares that the useless kid has finally woken up and complains that valuable time has been wasted because of him. A strange piece of food is pushed into his hands, and only then does he fully register his condition. His body is tightly wrapped in bandages and marked with painful bruises, leaving him stiff and sore. He stares at the hard, dried meat and feels openly disrespected by the miserable meal. The veteran orders him to stop complaining and eat, then shifts into a long account of his past as a young warrior. He explains that in earlier times, the strong naturally protected the weak, and survival was not as burdensome for the powerless. He then reflects that this balance has collapsed, and he admits he never adapted well to the brutality of the current age. Without tolerating any emotional hesitation, the old master forces a choice on him, explaining that remaining down means death, while standing up means survival. Xian forces himself to chew the tough food while sitting on the cold sand, and slowly comes to understand the meaning behind the words. As silence settles around the camp, he sinks into thought and begins understanding the weight of the veteran's experience. The stillness of the night makes the man's long history of battles feel even heavier, as if every memory is pressing down on him. He also notices that Deordan struggles to chew properly, softening the meat with saliva. He recognizes a survival method for conserving water in the dry land and quietly reacts with frustration, realizing this knowledge should have been shared earlier, before he nearly hurt himself. At the same time, his perception shifts slightly as he understands that the harsh behavior is not cruelty, but forced training meant to build independence. While continuing along the freezing path, his thoughts are broken when he suddenly remembers that he has never even seen a real fish, disrupting his serious reflection. Later, beneath the night sky, he abandons his hesitation and asks again for food, but his request is immediately denied. A sharp wind hits his injured body, forcing him to shiver uncontrollably as the temperature drops further. He complains that he could not sleep the previous night because the master spent hours speaking to his sword in the dark. Feeling dehydrated, he opens his mouth for water, but he is shocked when Deordan squeezes wet hair directly into it. He immediately recoils and spits out the water, angered by yet another survival method that was never explained to him. He then connects the situation and realizes they have been collecting dew from their clothes, which explains the camp is arranged like hanging laundry. He stares at Deordan with frustration and internally vows to grow strong enough to repay all the humiliation later. Before he can remain in thought, Deordan asks if he senses danger approaching. Xian answers sarcastically but abruptly stops when a faint tremor spreads beneath them. The ground begins to shake more clearly as something massive moves underground. A pack of demonic beasts surrounds them from all sides. The master explains that the great horned hyenas attack in violent bursts and often ambush intruders at unexpected hours. He casually draws his great sword and places the decision on Xian, asking whether he will rely on help or handle the fight himself. Without delay, one of the beasts launches itself toward them with a violent snarl. Zeon ignores the attack and instead points at himself with calm confidence, showing no fear even while surrounded. Completely encircled in darkness, he spreads his arms and declares that he will survive on his own. With a snap of his fingers, a rotating blade of sand forms around his hand, showing improved control of his mana for combat use. He takes control of the terrain and releases a wide sandstorm that spreads outward. While maintaining focus, he keeps his attention steady through the chaos. Sand spikes erupt violently and pierce multiple charging beasts. He angrily demands to know how many enemies are still coming as he fights. Soon after, he feels the strain in his body and realizes that continuing like this will drain his mana and leave him defenseless. Seeing the endless wave of enemies, he understands that raw power will not be enough and that efficiency is necessary. He tries to adjust his thinking and searches for a method that consumes less energy while still dealing damage. As he prepares to test a new approach, a hyena suddenly attacks from the side and bites into his arm. He curses the creature as blood spills from the wound, frustrated by the unexpected strike. He looks at the injury and notices the damage, and that exact moment triggers a new idea in his mind. The pack continues advancing without stopping, intent on tearing him apart. As they close in, Zeon quickly finalizes his plan and realizes he only needs a single opening. With a sudden motion, he fires a thin sand projectile that pierces straight through the skull of a charging beast. Zeon then breaks into laughter as he realizes that defeating the beasts does not require large explosions, since a precise hit to the head is enough to bring them down. With his focus locked in, he starts refining his control and quickly understands that wasting mana out of panic only pushes him closer to death. This realization shapes his new approach. He starts firing controlled, precise attacks, treating them as low-cost, lethal shots, and becomes excited about this more efficient fighting method. As the battle continues, he notices that even the master is calmly eliminating one by one, which further boosts his confidence. Jordan remains completely unfazed by a charging creature and casually insults it, treating the attack as if it were nothing. A massive red-eyed hyena stares him down, but instead of fear, Jordan mocks it and calls it a smelly mutt. He then draws his sword and explains that a biting animal cannot be allowed to live, while his expression shifts into a disturbing smile that shows his enjoyment of violence. This intense aura reaches Zeon from afar, causing him to step back in panic as he realizes that Jordan is about to go into another dangerous state. The warrior then erupts in a loud declaration that the real massacre is beginning, and a devastating blast of red energy tears through the battlefield, destroying everything in its path. The shockwave hits Zeon with full force and throws him backward as he screams while trying to steady himself. When the dust settles, he looks at the destruction and complains about how reckless the attack was in an area where someone could easily get caught. The desert is left carved open, a deep trench filled with blood and the remains of monsters, and Zeon stands at its edge in shock. He asks in disbelief whether the master is even human, since such power appears without the use of magic. Overwhelmed by fear, he decides to stay quiet from now on, but his thoughts are interrupted when a low growl rises from below the ground. The alpha beast appears and lets out a loud roar, while Jordan reacts by mocking its dramatic entrance. The creature responds by releasing dangerous electric sparks across its body, forming a powerful energy field. Jordan immediately analyzes it and concludes that the creature must be at least rank B or higher. A violent storm of lightning erupts and engulfs him completely in the middle of the desert night. Zeon watches in panic and warns the master internally, thinking he has been caught in the attack. The electrical discharge continues with full force, and Zeon becomes convinced that Jordan has been defeated. However, Jordan stands inside the lightning without concern, and even describes the sensation as a refreshing massage that loosens his body. With a terrifying expression, he declares that the warm-up is over and moves forward with overwhelming strength. In a single motion, he slams the beast's head into the ground with brutal force, ending its resistance instantly. Zeon laughs nervously in relief and realizes that worrying about this man only causes unnecessary stress, so he chooses to ignore his abnormal strength for his own peace of mind. Jordan then walks back carrying the beast's head, while Zeon asks with excitement if they are finally leaving the area. The master focuses on the creature's horn and explains that it can become a strong weapon if properly refined. He then casually throws an object towards Zeon and orders him to catch it, and Zeon grabs a worn dagger in response. He receives a direct instruction that from now on, he must hunt his own food without relying on anyone else. As Diordan slices the beast, he explains that the muscles of a great horned hyena are toxic and will kill anyone who eats them, while only the flank meat is safe. While Zeon watches closely, he is ordered to move quickly as the sun is about to rise, and he immediately snaps back to attention as daylight begins to break over the horizon. As they continue walking, Zeon's confidence grows, and he eats the meat, finding it better than expected. He wipes sweat from his face and complains internally about growing thirst, but he forces himself to stay positive because his stomach is finally full. With his new skill active, he moves across the dunes easily and feels proud of his progress. In a moment of arrogance, he mocks Diordan and asks if Diordan is jealous, which immediately results in a punch that snaps his head back. He quickly recovers and dodges the next attack while laughing, satisfied that he avoided damage this time. Diordan calls him foolish for becoming overconfident after learning a single simple technique, while Zeon ends up on his knees in the sand, apologizing and reminding him that he is still struggling with thirst and did not deserve punishment. While still complaining about being ignored, Zeon suddenly stops when he feels a humid breeze in the air. At first, he doubts his senses, but then he notices that Diordan is also staring in the same direction. Both of them shift their attention forward as a faint sense of hope appears, suggesting the presence of an oasis. They stand together on top of the dunes and look out at the burning desert, waiting for confirmation of what lies ahead. Zeon's expression changes into excitement as he realizes that something he only heard about in rumors might actually exist in front of him. In front of him, the water's reflection becomes visible, revealing a real oasis shining in the sunlight. Zeon runs forward, focused only on his memory of days with a dry throat. Diordan stands still on the ridge and clicks his tongue, suspicious that something feels wrong. Zeon reaches the slope, loses control, slides down fast, and shouts in relief when he sees water within reach. Without hesitation, he jumps straight and sinks into the cold water. The relief hits instantly as he floats on the surface and breathes out deeply, letting the water soak through his exhausted body. The heat of the desert feels distant for a moment, replaced by complete calm, and his mind starts to slow down under the comfort. As his body relaxes, his vision blurs, and his awareness fades without warning. While drifting in the water, he notices a strange glowing orb deep at the bottom of the lagoon, radiating a strong light that pulls his attention. The glow confuses his senses, and his body begins to sink into drowsiness, as if the light itself is sapping his strength. At that moment, Diordan's voice cuts sharply through the air as he forces Zeon to wake up. Without wasting time, Diordan jumps with extreme speed and draws his sword mid-air while closing the distance in an instant. He drops toward the shallow water like a falling weapon, fully prepared for impact. Suddenly, a massive sand anglerfish erupts from beneath the surface with a wide, jagged mouth ready to swallow anything nearby. Diordan reacts immediately and grabs Zeon by the collar, pulling him back with force before the creature can reach him. The monster fully emerges, revealing its huge and disturbing body as Zeon is thrown backward, completely shocked by how close the danger was. Diordan lands firmly on the sand and places himself between Zeon and the beast. Without hesitation, he tightens his grip on his sword and prepares a counterattack. In a single motion, he swings down with overwhelming force, and the strike cuts through the water itself. The beast is sliced cleanly in half and collapses, leaving the scene in complete silence. Zeon stares at the aftermath and finally understands that the glowing light he mistook for safety is actually part of a trap, similar to what he had heard before about deceptive desert creatures. A faint rainbow-like shimmer appears as the energy fades from the water, confirming the illusion's nature. Diordan explains that the creature is a full gorge, and that it uses the light on its head to lure prey into attacking range before devouring them. After finishing the explanation, he turns his attention back to Zeon with a sharp expression. Without warning, he delivers a heavy punch to Zeon's head, knocking him into the sand. He scolds him harshly, stating that all previous training is being forgotten just because of a single, simple trick. He continues the warning by stressing that careless people like him are the first to die in places like this. Zeon shakes in fear and immediately agrees while trying to recover from the blow. Diordan then orders him to skin the creature, which leaves Zeon confused at first. He explains that the full gorge is a rank sea monster and that its belly material is soft and suitable for making stitched clothing, such as a robe. While asking whether Zeon wants new clothes, he immediately resumes scolding him, questioning his intelligence, and telling him to make his own tunic rather than rely on others. Zeon awkwardly apologizes again, trying to calm the situation. As he studies the monster, he notices it resembles fish from Earth, which confuses him because of his limited experience. Dioyorden remarks that he has likely never seen a real fish before, and Zeon confirms that this is indeed his first time seeing such a creature. He grips his dagger nervously and mutters that fish-like creatures feel dangerous. He tries to stab the monster's back, but the blade fails to cause real damage due to the tough surface. Dioyorden mocks his attempt, commenting that it looks like he is trying to pet the creature, then prepares to take over. Zeon refuses help and continues thinking, realizing that the hide is too strong for basic cutting. He decides to improve his method by channeling mana directly into his weapon, coating the blade to increase its cutting strength. He also plans ahead by using the thin fins as makeshift needles. He then connects the final steps of his idea by deciding to extract tendons from the body to use as stitching thread. While Zeon works through this process, Dioyorden sits at a distance, watching with clear disappointment, treating the attempt as a waste of valuable material and silently judging his lack of skill. Zeon struggles through repeated failures until exhaustion builds up, but Dioyorden only sighs and informs him that there is still enough material left for more attempts. The night fully settles over the endless desert while they continue working without pause. After several tries, Zeon finally completes the task and lifts the finished piece into the air, shouting in relief as he celebrates his hard work. Finally, after multiple failures, this version is acceptable and good enough for use. Dioyorden immediately interrupts his celebration and calls him back to attention while Zeon tightly holds the robe out of fear that it might be taken away again. Dioyorden then dismisses his complaints and produces a large organ from the monster, ordering him to consume it. Zeon becomes confused, and Dioyorden explains that the full gorge gall is a rare medicinal item that must be eaten whole. He further warns that refusing it will lead to death during the journey, forcing Zeon into compliance. The heavy organ is dropped into his lap, and Dioyorden complains that his arm is getting tired from holding it. Zeon stares at the strange, unpleasant piece of meat and gathers himself before forcing a bite, choosing survival over hesitation. He continues chewing, admitting to himself that the bitter taste is still better than dying on the road. As he keeps eating, he becomes increasingly confused by the strange texture, noticing that it feels light and almost empty, offering little real fullness. After finishing the last bite in a rush, he is called again by Dioyorden, who sits calmly near the fire and announces that the next phase is beginning. Zeon fails to understand the meaning, but suddenly feels a change inside his body as his chest begins to glow. The glow intensifies quickly and triggers intense internal pain, forcing him to cough blood while screaming in agony. The burning sensation spreads through his body, and he clutches his stomach as he realizes his internal energy is spiraling out of control. He feels as if a burning core is forming inside him, overwhelming his system and pushing his limits to the limit. While he suffers, Dioyorden continues speaking calmly and instructs him to endure the process rather than resist it. Dioyorden then looks into the dark desert and explains that everything in this land follows the same cycle, where things appear and disappear like illusions in shifting sand. He further states that even monsters return from the depths and repeat the same cycle of existence. He describes this as the natural cruelty of life, continuing his explanation without reacting to Zeon's suffering. Zeon loses control of his pain and begins begging for relief, completely overwhelmed by the burning inside his body. His frustration turns into desperation as he mentally collapses and vows anger toward Dioyorden for forcing him into this condition. Despite his cries, Dioyorden settles on the ground and orders silence so he can rest. By morning, Zeon slowly regains consciousness and opens his eyes on warm sand, still disoriented from the previous night. Dioyorden's face appears directly above him, asking if the useless brat has finally woken up. Startled by the sudden sight, Zeon jumps back and reacts angrily, overwhelmed by the shock. Dioyorden laughs at Zeon's reaction and mentions that he slept well, while Zeon, still recovering, complains about being forced into unconsciousness. The master asks about his condition, prompting Zeon to examine his body. Zeon immediately notices a drastic change in his strength. His muscles feel denser and his mana flows with intensity. Confused by this sudden transformation, he questions how such rapid improvement is possible. As they walk through the desert, Dioyorden explains that the strength comes from the full gorge gall he consumed. He adds that the organ grants extreme heat resistance and has a value similar to that of a high-grade refined mana stone. Zeon reacts in surprise and questions whether using something so valuable on him was a waste. Dio Jordan responds with a laugh and explains that the decision was made because Zeon was too weak and needed to become useful for the journey ahead. He then sits down and continues eating roasted meat, declaring that they will not leave until everything is finished. After 4 days of continuous eating, Diordan notices that more meat remains than expected, but decides to move on. He packs up the camp and informs Zeon that it is time to return to the desert trail. Zeon, now refreshed and strengthened, follows the order without hesitation. As they continue, Zeon walks directly into a sandstorm but feels no discomfort, as the wind now feels light against his body. He follows closely behind Diordan and becomes surprised by Diordan's unmatched endurance throughout the harsh journey. While moving through the storm, Zeon silently complains about Diordan's long silence and wonders if he is experiencing some kind of personal crisis. After 2 weeks of continuous travel, Zeon becomes frustrated and questions whether Diordan even knows their destination. Suddenly, a giant insect bursts out of the sand beside him, releasing a sharp screech that cuts through the storm. Diordan glances back and coldly orders him to shut up mid-complaint. Zeon sighs in exhaustion and asks how far they still need to go, but his question is cut off when an impact pushes him forward. He quickly turns around and sees a massive mutant ant charging from behind with deadly speed and heavily armored jaws. Looking down, he realizes that he had only intended to walk through the desert peacefully, but the situation has already turned into another battle. A wider view reveals that they are completely surrounded by multiple creatures, forming a tight encirclement. Zeon steps forward, crouches, and places his hand on the sand while challenging the enemies to attack together. He channels his energy into the ground and releases sharp sand spikes upward, stating internally that he must finish the fight quickly before Diordan loses patience with him. Zeon continues the fight by pointing his fingers at his enemies and firing compressed sand shots that move like bullets. Each shot pierces through the rushing enemies, and he mentally praises how smoothly the technique works as the targets drop to the ground. The ring makes him feel like he has unlimited attacks in a storm, boosting his confidence. While scanning the battlefield, he suddenly notices that Diordan is no longer beside him, which makes him panic and shout in anger at being left alone. He sprints across the loose sand while complaining that Diordan has no sense of responsibility, and he connects this behavior to the idea that the man is naturally isolated and difficult to rely on. His anger continues until he suddenly stops mid-step, realizing that saying such things out loud might have reached Diordan. This fear changes his behavior immediately, and he prepares to correct himself if needed, sensing a heavy pressure in the air. His instincts react before his thoughts fully form, and he jumps backward as a dangerous presence spreads across the battlefield. When he lands and stabilizes his footing, he realizes that the energy he is sensing is not from any normal monster but something far more oppressive and unnatural. A massive wave of giant ants floods over the dunes like a moving disaster, covering everything in sight with claws and bodies. The sight overwhelms him, and panic forces him to question where such an enormous number of creatures even came from. He looks around desperately while shouting for Diordan, reporting that the situation has become unmanageable, but Diordan remains far away, sitting calmly and observing without moving. The lack of response forces Zeon to confront the situation himself, and he realizes that depending on help will not keep him alive. This thought pushes him to accept that the enemy formation was already expected, meaning this is a planned survival test rather than an accident. This realization triggers a shift in his mindset, and adrenaline takes over as he commits to fighting through everything alone. He immediately releases bursts of sand explosions that destroy the first incoming wave of ants, clearing space in front of him. The brief advantage disappears when a sudden impact strikes his chest, throwing him backward and breaking his balance completely. Before he can recover, he is overwhelmed by the swarm and dragged into the mass of enemies. While trapped on the ground, he struggles violently and curses their tactics, frustrated that they attack in numbers rather than face him directly. As more jaws close in from above, he prepares to accept the incoming fatal strike. At the last moment, he triggers a large mana explosion beneath his own body, forcing the surrounding ants away and creating a brief opening. Using that gap, he pushes himself upward and breaks free from the immediate encirclement. As he rises into the air, he sees the scale of the battlefield and realizes that the entire valley is filled with an endless ant colony. This sight briefly relieves him when he assumes height will give him safety, and he convinces himself that flying enemies are impossible for insects. That thought breaks instantly when a heavy impact strikes his back mid-air. A winged ant grabs him and lifts him away, causing complete shock as he realizes the creature is actually capable of flight. The monster digs its claws into him and releases a harsh screech directly into his ear before diving back toward the ground at extreme speed. The impact crushes him into the earth and knocks the air out of his lungs, forcing him to cough up blood in pain. He lies face down in the sand, struggling to breathe while destruction continues around him. Slowly lifting his injured face, he gathers his remaining strength and focuses his eyes with determination. From a distance on higher ground, Jordan hears Zeon calling his name and demanding attention. Despite his injuries, Zeon forces himself to speak with defiance and tells the master to watch as he survives this situation. Jordan finally responds, stating that this attitude is necessary and pointing out that Zeon's awakened ability is rare in a world that has turned into a wasteland. He further explains that Zeon may already be thinking about returning to civilization and gaining power, but warns that in this world, such ambition attracts dangerous attention. He adds that even after the collapse of society, the greed of powerful individuals has not changed, and anyone with valuable abilities becomes a target. He concludes that awakening power is not about desire but survival itself, and tells Zeon to endure as an awakened being and continue surviving until the very end of this harsh world. Jordan continues speaking while watching the battlefield and explains that nothing is more miserable than surviving in the way he once did. Deep inside himself, he still carries the memories of the disaster from 100 years ago, a tragedy remembered by most people as nothing more than a distant flash of light. For him, however, those memories remain painfully alive. The sight of loved ones being torn apart stays carved into his mind even after all these years, and he explains that this is the burden every survivor carries. He believes survival itself means endlessly crossing the line between life and death while dragging those memories forward forever. Because of that suffering, he refuses to accept losing against monsters and pushes Zeon to understand the same truth. As those words sink in, Zeon controls violent cyclones with his bare hands and finally begins showing the results of everything he has endured. Overflowing with energy, he faces the swarm directly and confidently declares that the creatures are about to be destroyed. One giant ant crawls forward through the sand without reacting to the pressure gathering around him. Zeon focuses his mana and compresses countless grains of sand together, shaping them into a giant drill-like projectile. The attack becomes extremely dense and heavy before launching across the battlefield like a missile. He combines wind force, gravity, and raw mana into a single attack, and the impact completely destroys the target in an instant. Realizing how much stronger this technique is compared to his earlier attacks, Zeon throws his arms up in excitement and understands that his destructive power has increased massively. His aura explodes outward while he roars toward the swarm, declaring that their extermination begins now. Violent explosions erupt across the center of the battlefield, and Zeon blames the creatures for failing to kill him earlier when they had the chance. From a distance, Jordan watches calmly with folded arms and observes our guy's reckless excitement without interfering. Meanwhile, Zeon remains standing in the middle of the dust cloud, barely able to breathe as shattered insect bodies rain down around him. The desert itself becomes unrecognizable after the battle, as a gigantic crater tears through the ancient sands and marks the complete destruction of the anthill. Zeon coughs heavily while trying to recover from the massive amount of mana he just consumed. Despite his exhaustion, he immediately calls out toward Jordan, wanting acknowledgement for what he achieved, but blood spills from his mouth before he can continue. At that moment, a shadow falls over him, and confusion spreads across his face because he cannot understand how anything survived. Without warning, a hidden creature attacks from behind and digs sharp claws into his body. The moment blood begins flowing, Zeon realizes the enemy was hiding its presence and quickly understands that poison has entered his system. He feels his mana points shutting down one after another and immediately concludes that the venom is blocking his abilities. Furious at the unfair attack, he curses the monsters for catching him off guard, but before he can react further, another heavy strike crashes into his head. Darkness quickly consumes his vision, and he realizes the situation has become far worse than before. When he regains consciousness, he slowly opens his eyes and notices several glowing red eyes staring at him from the darkness. He immediately understands that he has been dragged into the nest. The cold ground beneath him and the disgusting insect noises echoing through the tunnels make the reality impossible to ignore. As creatures begin crawling closer, Zeon notices they are larvae preparing to feed. He struggles to move but discovers that one of his arms is completely paralyzed. A giant grub presses its jaws against his body, ready to tear into him, and he realizes he is moments away from being eaten alive. Unable to move properly, he begins accepting death and wonders if this is truly where everything ends for him. The larvae continue slithering closer, preparing to consume him while he lies helpless on the ground. Then suddenly, his fist tightens violently and digs into the dirt. The nearby ants recoil in surprise as his body starts resisting again. Shaking from effort and pain, Zeon forces himself upward while cursing his own weakness. His frustration explodes into pure rage as he rejects the idea of dying in such a meaningless way after surviving this long. The bracelet on his arm suddenly begins glowing brightly while his anger surges out of control. With a snap of his fingers, a violent burst of dark energy sweeps through the nest floor. Smaller creatures are blown away instantly, unable to withstand the crushing force. The violent winds continue smashing the monsters into the cave walls, while the entire nest trembles from the impact. Dust fills the tunnels and blinds the area, creating the perfect opening. Taking advantage of the chaos, Zeon manipulates the sand beneath him and raises a pillar upward, escaping the monsters below. Zeon stares at his hands in disbelief after realizing the poison has completely disappeared from his body. At the same time, overwhelming energy rushes through him far more intensely than before. When he looks down at the glowing display on his wrist, he finally understands that he has leveled up. The sudden increase in strength immediately changes his confidence, and he concludes that his current state is far beyond the weak F-rank level he once had. Even with all that new power flowing through him, his attention remains fixed on the giant ant queen standing before him completely unharmed. The creature continues moving along the cave walls with terrifying speed while charging directly toward him. Its body crushes solid stone effortlessly, and the sheer physical strength behind every movement leaves Zeon stunned. The queen tears through the tunnel like an unstoppable force, destroying the surroundings and sending sharp debris flying everywhere. Zeon barely manages to dodge the attacks and grows frustrated after realizing that all of his earlier techniques failed to damage her at all. While clinging to the wall to keep himself from falling, he accepts that winning through brute force is impossible. As he watches the glowing eyes moving through the dust, he quickly understands that blindly charging forward will only get him killed. His mind starts racing as he desperately searches for another method to overcome the monster's defense. Instead of trying to pierce the armor directly, he focuses on the idea of tearing the shell apart completely. The grotesque queen releases a deafening scream and prepares for another charge. Zeon responds by gathering all his mana into one hand and decides to use rotational force to rip the armor away from the inside. The queen senses the danger immediately and rushes toward him with even greater aggression. Without hesitation, Zeon launches a concentrated spinning attack straight at the creature's head. The violent energy twists rapidly as he tries to shred the monster internally instead of breaking through from the outside. However, the queen suddenly unleashes a powerful sonic attack that crashes into him instantly. The high-pitched frequency tears through the cave and feels strong enough to split his brain apart. A violent shockwave spreads through the air, distorting everything around the clash. Blood runs down Zeon's face while he grits his teeth in anger after realizing the monster had been hiding this ability the entire time. Despite the damage, his survival instincts completely take over, and he decides to gamble everything on one final exchange. He releases every remaining drop of mana inside his body, causing the sandstorm around him to spiral out of control. Ignoring the strain on his own body, he pushes forward with the mindset that one of them will collapse first. Covered in blood and screaming through the pain, Zeon charges directly at the queen with the intention of fighting until the end. The collision reaches its peak, and then complete silence fills the cave. As the light fades, confusion spreads across his face when he realizes he can no longer feel his arms or legs. His body slowly falls backward, and he bitterly understands that he has pushed himself far beyond his physical limits. Darkness starts swallowing his consciousness, and he curses his own weak body for failing him at the most important moment. Before he can hit the ground completely, Deoyordan suddenly catches him firmly by the shoulders and calls him weak. Carrying the exhausted boy without much care, Deoyordan mocks him for nearly dying after collapsing in a place like this. Zeon, barely conscious, mutters Deoyordan's name while feeling overwhelming relief that the fight is over. In response, Deoyordan grins widely and admits that he intentionally left the final battle to Zeon so he could prove himself through survival. He then acknowledges Zeon's determination and explains that the Wolf Queen was a C-rank creature far stronger than him, meaning surviving against it already proves he deserves to stay alive. Zeon tries maintaining his usual attitude and complains that the sonic attack destroyed his hearing, leaving him unable to hear properly anymore. Deoyordan finds his condition amusing and deliberately shouts even louder near his damaged ears. While being dragged around carelessly by the collar, Zeon tries figuring out where they are heading next. Eventually, the two reach a hidden chamber deep inside the anthill illuminated by a strange glow. Once placed down on the ground, Zeon notices a glowing orb resting on a pedestal and stares at it in complete confusion. Unable to understand what he is looking at, he turns toward Deoyordan for an explanation. Instead of answering normally, Deoyordan roughly pushes his head forward and orders him to eat the queen's egg as casually as if it were simple medicine with a sweet flavor. Zeon immediately feels disgusted at the thought of eating the strange glowing egg and mentally curses the situation. As he stares at the orb more closely, he seriously doubts something that large can even fit down his throat properly. The memory of the previous painful medicine makes him suspicious, and he worries this thing might destroy his stomach all over again. Deoyordan responds with careless sarcasm and implies that it could even kill him, but Zeon barely reacts anymore after everything he has already survived. Accepting his situation with a tired sigh, he finally bites into the egg and forces himself to swallow it while hoping his body survives the process. As he chews, he realizes he has no idea what real strawberries are supposed to taste like, so he cannot even compare the flavor properly. However, the moment the glowing substance slides down his throat, his expression changes in surprise because the taste is unexpectedly delicious. The pleasant reaction only lasts a moment before something strange begins happening inside his body. Zeon suddenly drops to his knees in panic as an unbearable sensation spreads through him, and he desperately tries to understand what is happening. The egg triggers a terrifying process known for driving people insane from pain. Its poison violently affects the body from the inside, twisting organs and rupturing everything internally. The toxic reaction becomes so severe that the victim's insides feel like they are tearing apart while sharp spikes burst outward through flesh. Zeon screams in complete agony as the pain overwhelms his body, and he accuses Deoyordan of feeding him poison. Meanwhile, Deoyordan casually scratches his ear and complains about the noise while explaining that enduring pain like this is necessary for survival. Zeon's face swells badly as the suffering continues, and he cannot understand how anyone could possibly withstand this level of torture. The pressure inside him keeps building until he starts coughing violently, spitting thick, dark sludge onto the cave floor. His strength disappears completely, and he feels as though his body has finally reached its limit. As darkness slowly takes over his vision, regret fills his mind because he realizes he actually allowed himself to trust someone again. Collapsed on the cold ground, he accepts what he believes is his final mistake and convinces himself that trusting Deoyordan only proved how foolish he really is. Soon his body becomes completely motionless among the spikes that tore through his flesh. Deoyordan pays no attention to the unconscious boy and instead crouches beside the dead ant queen to collect his reward. Without hesitation, he pushes his hand deep into the mangled remains and pulls out the object he was searching for. When he sees the glowing mana jewel in his hand, satisfaction spreads across his face as he realizes he has obtained something extremely valuable. He also notices that the queen's corpse still contains useful materials, so he decides to take everything with him. After storing the loot away, Deoyordan stands up and adjusts the sword on his back before quietly looking toward Zeon's lifeless body. His expression grows heavier for a moment as he softly speaks the word friend, almost as if recalling someone from long ago. While staring at the spike-covered body, he quietly convinces himself that weak people simply die and that this outcome was unavoidable for Zeon. With that conclusion, he turns away from the body and slowly walks deeper into the tunnel. As he continues moving, he keeps speaking to himself and justifies that there is no time left to hesitate anymore. Then, just as the cave falls silent again, a weak and confused voice suddenly echoes behind him, wondering why breathing is still possible. Deoyordan instantly turns around, and a huge grin spreads across his face when he realizes Zeon is alive. Before he can react further, a violent burst of dark energy explodes from the area where Zeon had collapsed, throwing dust across the cave and blinding everything nearby. Deoyordan shields his face and curses the reckless behavior while demanding an explanation for the sudden explosion of dirt. However, His irritation disappears the moment he senses the overwhelming pressure pouring out from Xion's body. A monstrous aura fills the cave, and even Dio Jordan becomes visibly shocked by the intensity of it. Then Xion bursts through the dust cloud and charges directly toward him with uncontrollable rage written all over his face. Despite the killing intent rushing toward him, Dio Jordan remains completely calm and dismisses the emotional outburst, insisting that Xion stop acting blindly and listen carefully first. Xion completely ignores Dio Jordan's attempt to calm him down and rushes past him at terrifying speed. The ground cracks beneath his feet as rage takes over his mind, and disbelief keeps repeating inside his head. Fueled entirely by hatred, he throws a violent attack straight at Jordan while demanding an explanation for the betrayal he believes nearly killed him. The force behind the strike creates a brutal storm inside the tunnel, making it obvious that Xion has no intention of holding back. Dark magic overflows from his eyes while bloodlust consumes his thoughts, and he swears he will never forgive what happened to him. Despite all that fury, Dio Jordan casually stops the incoming punch with one hand, as if he is catching something completely harmless. The impact tears apart the tunnel wall and leaves behind a massive crater, yet Dio Jordan's stance never moves even slightly. Breathing heavily from the strain, Xion finally understands the overwhelming difference between them. Even after leveling up, his strongest attack fails to leave the slightest mark. Shock spreads across his face because Dio Jordan blocks everything effortlessly, and then sighs in disappointment at the reckless attempt. Standing calmly in the dust, Dio Jordan sarcastically remarks that the poison from the egg must have damaged Xion's brain and urges him to think properly before acting like an idiot.
Stop it. Get some help.
Xion remains frozen from the shock because his full-powered strike achieved absolutely nothing. Dio Jordan then explains that using poison against Xion would have been pointless since killing him directly would have been far easier. Hearing that logic pulls Xion back to reality, and embarrassment quickly replaces his anger. Looking down awkwardly, he realizes the explanation actually makes complete sense. Dio Jordan then reveals that the queen's egg changes depending on how it is used. While it can act as deadly poison, it can also become a sacred medicine, capable of purging impurities from the body through unbearable pain. After cleansing the body, the medicine fills the empty space with pure mana, which explains the overwhelming energy Xion felt during his earlier attack. When Xion clenches his fist, dark lightning crackles around it, and he realizes his mana reserves have increased several times over. Emotion immediately overwhelms him after understanding how enormous this gift really is. Unable to contain himself, he calls out to Dio Jordan and jumps forward to hug him tightly while apologizing for doubting him. Dio Jordan immediately looks disgusted by the emotional outburst and tries shoving him away, but Xion suddenly notices that his hearing has completely returned. A faint smirk appears on Dio Jordan's face as he orders our dude to let go already, but Xion stubbornly refuses to release the hug. While enduring the awkward situation, Dio Jordan quietly continues his thoughts to himself and admits internally that the gamble truly could have killed our dude. Hidden beneath his calm attitude, genuine relief settles in because Xion only survives due to his unusually tough body. Tightening his grip on the hilt of his sword, Dio Jordan accepts that he forced such a brutal method because Xion needed to grow stronger quickly, instead of remaining weak forever. The mood suddenly shifts when Dio Jordan grabs Xion under one arm like luggage and immediately starts moving. Dangling helplessly in the air, Xion becomes irritated at being carried around again, but Dio Jordan completely ignores the complaints. Instead, he points toward the cave ceiling and urgently explains that they need to escape immediately because their time has already run out. The warning instantly makes Xion realize something disastrous is about to happen. Far above them in the desert, two giant scorpions continue fighting beneath the blazing sun. Then, without warning, an enormous explosion of sand erupts from underground and completely swallows both monsters while tearing open the desert itself. At the same time, Dio Jordan launches himself through the air at insane speed like a living missile. He laughs wildly during the escape while proudly bragging about their speed, whereas Xion screams in frustration and demands a normal journey for once. Dio Jordan dismisses the complaints and blames everything on Xion for remaining unconscious inside the nest for 4 entire days. While continuing his lecture about our dude's miserable condition, Dio Jordan suddenly falls silent after noticing a strange shadow forming on the horizon. Completely exhausted by non-stop chaos, Zeon claims that nothing in this insane world can surprise him anymore. However, that confidence disappears the moment he follows Deoyordan's gaze. Floating high in the sky like tiny insects, the two of them are completely dwarfed by the silhouette of a gigantic creature moving through the clouds. The enormous beast tears through the sky itself, while its sheer size dominates the horizon from dozens of miles away. Terror spreads across Zeon's face because he cannot comprehend how a magical beast can possibly be that massive. Once they land on the desert floor, Deoyordan calmly reveals that the creature is Arsalan, the moving fortress. As the giant turtle slowly marches through the dunes, Deoyordan explains that people actually tame these nearly indestructible creatures and modify their shells into massive transportation platforms. Zeon stares toward the monster in disbelief because he cannot imagine ordinary people willingly riding on something that terrifying. Overwhelmed by everything he has seen, he grabs his head and feels as though the world itself has become too huge and insane to understand anymore. Deoyordan only makes things worse by explaining that even stronger creatures exist, including beings powerful enough to tame monsters like Arsalan. While watching the fortress-like beast continue across the desert, Deoyordan explains that Zeon needs to witness sights like this if he truly wants to become stronger. Then both of them suddenly notice a tiny dark figure leaping directly from the turtle's shell high above. The figure plummets through the sky before crashing violently into the sand ahead of them. A massive cloud of dust explodes outward and blocks their path completely. Alarmed by the sudden appearance, Zeon tries identifying the newcomer, but Deoyordan immediately orders him to stay silent. Tension fills the air as a calm voice emerges from within the dust and remarks that it has been a very long time. Moments later, a giant elderly man with glowing eyes slowly steps out from the cloud of sand and reveals himself while calling Deoyordan's name with overwhelming authority.